in Ohio, and excited to hear a little bit more about it in the discussion section. But I'm going to spend a little time talking about some of the research that we've been doing around career navigation, specifically, what works, what doesn't work, and really how we can build an ecosystem moving forward. So I'm going to share my screen. Let's see here. Okay, can everyone see that? Wonderful. So the research I'm going to share with you is also included in a paper that we published called Unlocking Economic Prosperity. And we published it in collaboration with the National Fund for Workforce Solutions, and it was really a joint academic and field effort. We reviewed about 360 peer-reviewed articles, reports, book chapters, and then held a convening and several interviews and focus groups with leaders in the field, experts, and frontline workers, where we were able to kind of gather both primary and secondary research around how folks are navigating their careers in today's changing environment. I'll first tell you a little bit about the Project on Workforce so you have some background on where we approach this from. We're pretty unique in that we're a collaboration across Harvard. So we're an interdisciplinary effort between the business school, the policy school, and the education school. And so we bring in perspectives across those three kind of focus areas and disciplines, and our focus is on applied research for those stakeholders. So really getting the information, the best evidence in the hands of decision makers in policy, education, and business, because so often in research and in practice, as you all know, these fields are siloed. And so we really are trying to, from the research and ground up, cross those silos. Today, I'm going to share a little bit about the background, kind of ground us in the data, and then talk about what we learned from the evidence around what career navigation is, what we know works. I'm going to talk a little bit about the landscape, and I'm going to spend quite a bit of time on this part of the presentation because Jill thought this might be particularly interesting to everyone. Then I'm going to kind of go into stakeholder recommendations, and I'm excited to hear that there are so many folks from across the Ohio ecosystem here, and so hopefully each of the topics I touch on will be relevant to different folks on this call. So what is the challenge? And many of you know this already, but I think it's helpful to see the data, is that over the past 50 years, wages have stagnated for individuals making below the median wage, as you can see. And the vast majority of these individuals do not have a college degree. We've seen that over time, really what's developed is one pathway to prosperity, that's through a bachelor's degree. And many of the other pathways are broken. And people of color are overwhelmingly overrepresented in this population. And we also find that low wage work tends to be sticky. So when surveys are done of individuals making, $40,000 or less per year, 5 years later, they will still be in either the same job or a different job, earning about the same. So the pathways out of these jobs are really broken and really non-existent. And then this is also leading to kind of pervasive occupational segregation. You can look at Black and Hispanic workers, even within sectors. We can look at the healthcare sector here and the administrative sector here are heavily concentrated in the lower earning positions in these fields. So, we can look at direct care workers, which are making about $30,000 a year. And although many of these jobs are designed to be on pathways to advancement, very often in reality, they aren't, and people become stuck in these jobs. And although they're crucial to society, we're not paying folks enough and providing opportunities. Similarly, research across these populations has found that for each additional year you're in a low-wage job, you are less likely to move out of that job. We see a similar trend with women in tech, by the way. So what is our system doing about this right now? Not a lot, although I know all the folks here are working towards this goal, which is really wonderful. I think the fact that we do not have support for pathways is really manifest in our public spending on upskilling and reskilling. We can see that the vast majority of public and private education is really spent on our front-loaded education system. So once folks are in the workforce, they're really left to themselves to try to navigate pathways. And so what do we do about this? We wanted to investigate what we call career navigation, and kind of the first piece of that is scoping or defining it. And so, grounding in the concept of a career, which we think of as more than a job, but really a series of connected education and work experiences, we look at this process, this continuous process of acquiring knowledge, making plans, and integrating and negotiating all of these actions throughout one's life. And, I think as we all think about our careers, we know that this is not a linear process. It's often very disjointed. It comes in different phases, but continuously we're, going through these different parts of the career navigation process to move forward. So what does this look like in reality? That's the ideal career navigation kind of cycle, but to understand what happens in the field and really what is driving career navigation kind of success, we looked at three groups of people, and specifically young people entering the labor market for the first time. So how do they launch? And we find that today younger people taking until about age 30 to get to where their parents were at age 20 in terms of good jobs. And we also find that white individuals are getting more good jobs faster than Black and Latinx individuals. We also look at adults working in low wage, low mobility jobs, and we find that across these populations, these individuals tend to be most unreached or underserved by our career navigation system. And then the third bucket is adults who are re-entering the workforce after a period of absence, whether that's from caregiving or from being involved in the justice system. And so while each journey, of course, is unique, we can see patterns across these three groups of people. And that led us to an understanding of what we call the 5 drivers of career navigation. I'm going to go over these briefly before I get into the landscape scan and kind of ecosystem recommendations, because these are all grounded in these 5 drivers, which are based in the evidence. So the first driver is information access and accuracy. And the least amount of evidence we found is here. There's some evidence that shows that with better information, people make more adaptive career choices. For example, there's a study of community college students that found that they often overestimate wages, and when they're told the actual wages of certain jobs, they're more likely to change their majors. But we know that right now information is often not clear. It's not provided to people where they are. So, we did an assessment of state WIOA websites, and while every state is different, in many cases, it's very difficult to kind of understand and navigate the information. We also know that skills and credentials are crucial to the way folks navigate, either presenting barriers or helping them move forward. And I want to highlight what we might call navigation skills, like adaptability and self-management, which are often not included in our education system or in some of the career services that are provided that are focused much more on the processes of job searching. We know that these are crucial. As well as the foundational or durable skills that we often talk about, like communication, that employers are increasingly seeking. The third driver I want to mention is social capital. And there's a pretty broad swath of research on social capital. We see that, folks tend to network or build social capital within their income brackets, which some have called network inequity. And this impacts people's access to hiring managers, access to interviews, internships, information about available jobs. However, Raj Chetty from Harvard has done some really interesting research that showed that neighborhoods that have stronger cross-connectedness or social capital connections across income brackets are higher social mobility areas. So a child born into one of those zip codes is more likely to move out of poverty. The fourth thing I want to point to is wraparound services and supports. And so this includes both, the guidance and the coaching that we know is crucial. And I'll get into the evidence around coaching shortly. But there's, a variety of studies that have shown that coaching in the workplace, in college, in many different situations is helpful for folks to kind of assess their own careers, understand their skills, and move forward. We also know that technology is becoming ever more important in the job search today, and many employers are much more likely to hire folks that they can find online. Technology, digital literacy is a skill that we certainly need to teach, and particularly for folks who may be coming out of the justice system, who haven't had access to this technology. It's especially a challenge. And then, as I mentioned, career navigation is both personal, but it's also structural. And so we can't look at the way individuals navigate their careers without thinking about the structures and ecosystems that are in place. And so some of these include, for example, our workforce policies that may incentivize rapid placement instead of long-term career advancement. Some of the pathways that employers are building within their organizations, and frankly, the economic conditions in a certain area. So what can we do about this? We evaluated the landscape of career navigation supports, we call them. We break them into 4 buckets. So we have services, tools, programs, and structures. And I'm going to go through each of these. And overall, the research base is pretty slim. And so we certainly need more evidence to understand what works and for whom. Because different folks have been served by different services and supports. And so we also find that the majority of evidence is based on small populations and small studies of students in college, individuals who may interact with American job centers, and oftentimes this sort of larger low-wage population has not been studied, and we're actually doing some of that research now. But in terms of coaching, we have in the paper, we look at, the definition, provide a promising example, and kind of highlight a couple of, the pros and cons essentially of each different service. And so we have coaching, mentoring, and networking are crucial. I'll say, we also map how each of these supports impacts the 5 drivers I just talked about. And oftentimes, based on our assessment, the more drivers that a support impacts, the more effective the research has shown it to be. And in many cases, folks just haven't done the studies. But coaching is one of the most well researched and has the strongest evidence behind it. But we know that this is very human capital intensive. There's a massive lack of trained coaches. And we really need to invest in this personnel. And we also don't have kind of a system of training for these coaches. Mentoring and networking, also crucial types of supports that we see across the spectrum, but we don't know a ton about the impact on specific populations, including people of color and people from low-income backgrounds. And oftentimes accessibility is very different, and networking within certain income brackets can perpetuate occupational segregation. There's also some evidence that online networking may actually harm self-efficacy and lead to more inequitable impacts. In terms of the tools that we have, the least amount of evidence is on the tools, and we're seeing these kind of pop up across the board, but we think of exploration and mapping, assessment tools, and nudging. And there are a lot of new examples of this. We're seeing AI being used in this case, but I think an important thing to remember is that it's very hard to evaluate the efficacy of these tools, and the evidence is mixed. And oftentimes, it has shown to be most effective when paired with human interpretation. So I don't think we can't quite assume that these will replace people. We'll talk a little bit about programs. So we looked at career navigation courses, career exposure courses, or programs, and intensive experiential programs, which we think of as like the year ups, the first scholases, which really touch all of the drivers. They provide information, social capital, skill development, and pathways within, and supports coaching as well as pathways within employers. And that has some of the strongest evidence, but compared again, to some of these other interventions, it's more resource intensive. And so I think as we, think about what is next, what the recommendation, what is required in order to build a more equitable career navigation system, we need to realize that this is going to be resource intensive and that we need to be committed to that. I'm going to highlight that career exposure we found is very rarely offered to adults. And so one of the gentlemen who was in one of our convenings had been involved in the justice system. And he said, no one ever asked me what I wanted to do. And I think we've seen this kind of across the board, with some of our interviews, particularly with folks in Gen Z and different kind of populations that they don't feel like they're being asked, and they feel kind of pigeonholed perhaps into high demand fields. And so this piece about asking people what they want to do, about exposing them to different careers, is something that's crucial at all ages. Of course, we want to start early, but even as we're serving adults in American Job Centers and the like, career exposure is still crucial. In terms of structures, which is the last bucket I'll talk about, we look at stackable pathways, some policies, really with a focus on kind of the incentive structures and the funding mechanisms, and then career centers across the board. And so there's pretty strong evidence that when individuals do stack credentials and do move along these pathways, it can lead to higher earnings, though it certainly depends on the field. And I don't think I'm telling folks, things you don't know. But I do think, the evidence is a little bit lacking in terms of how many people actually do follow these pathways, as I sort of mentioned in the beginning, and how many people do actually stack. And so while we need system change, we know that this is happening at kind of a slower level. Career centers, there's some research of the WIOA career centers that have shown that like a variety of these services are effective, but it requires folks to find them. And oftentimes very few people are really aware of those services. So what can we do about it? We create, based on the evidence and based on our landscape scan, guiding principles that we believe should underline any kind of system or program of career navigation. And I'm not going to go through all of these, and you can, take time to read it. You can, happy to chat afterwards, but to keep things moving, I'm going to highlight a few. So the first, again, which I mentioned, is communicating information in clear, relevant ways where people are. So that's finding young people on social media. We increasingly hear they're using TikTok to, decide which careers that they are interested in pursuing. And I'll kind of highlight, I'll pair that with high touch services that meet individuals in their communities. So we heard some really interesting examples of pop-up career services in community centers, in coffee shops, in grocery stores, to really meet people where they are. I would highlight, this need to develop the foundational and navigation skills. I think we hear a lot about durable skills, foundation skills. We don't hear as much about navigation skills. And as this, as we know, the half-life of skills is continuing to decrease, and the labor market is going to continue to change, individuals are going to need to have these skills of adaptability, self-management, lifelong learning. Many of these, I think you all really know about the wraparound supports and building trust. I will say locating, there's some great examples about building career centers in communities. Oakland has a really great example of this that's based on trust. Trust continued to come up again and again in our conversations. And I won't just say this because I'm a researcher, but we really do need to embed research and evaluation into career navigation services. And we need to disaggregate this research, these data to understand who is being served, where the equity gaps are, and what's working. I'm going to highlight some concrete recommendations that we have laid out for 5 stakeholders: employers, educators and trainers, intermediaries, and then in the next slide, I'll get to policymakers and philanthropy. And of course, learners and workers should be at the table, and equity should be centered above all else. But we think that, there are things that these stakeholders can do now to build a stronger career navigation system. I'm going to start with employers. Employers can be developing clear pathways and communicating clear pathways to their frontline employees. Joe Fuller has done some research called Building from the Bottom Up, but found that individuals would like to stay in their companies if they saw kind of a path to advancement. And so building those pathways, articulating those pathways is crucial, as well as providing exposure across the company to the different opportunities that exist. I think, we can't do a lot of these. We can't have these equitable talent practices. We can't have skills first talent practices, for example, without supporting middle managers, providing training for them, as well as incentives for promoting their employees to really support kind of a change management culture um, across the company. And then, of course, investing in upskilling to help folks move up, as well as tracking mobility within a company is crucial. There's a lot that educators and trainers can do to embed career navigation into their programs, including by providing career coaching, building these skills I've talked about, developing strong cohorts and networking to help people build social capital, bringing diverse professionals into the classroom to expand career exposure, and then considering using tools like AI and nudging to help scale efforts. Intermediaries can really be valuable tools for and valuable stakeholders for centering equity, for recruiting individuals from underrepresented populations, and really providing that career exposure, as I talked about, building that trust that's crucial. Policymakers and philanthropy also have an important role here. Policymakers, I think one of the biggest things we can do that is, of course, research intensive is investing in a career coaching workforce. I will say, we don't have a ton of evidence on what kind of training program for career coaches works, but we do have some examples of certifications. For example, I think Virginia is developing one that we can look to potentially start use as a promising practice. We can use the policies, the incentives, the reporting mechanisms through WIOA and other federal statutes and state statutes to incentivize career progression over time and wage growth, providing universal access to pathways and upskilling, and then collecting disaggregated data and setting racial equity goals for mobility. And lastly, I'll say philanthropy can play an important role here as a research and development arm, and really leaning into that, de-risking some investments for employers, for educators, for some of the intermediaries and other organizations in this space, and investing in innovative solutions that then can be scaled if they work. We know that the voices of individuals from low wage jobs and from kind of underserved populations are crucial here. And so supporting leaders with lived experience, and then again, advancing the research, which I know often you'll hear me say many, many times, but I do think we should be grounding all of our recommendations in research. And so I have some discussion questions, but I know Jill wanted to pass it to a few folks to provide some remarks or reflections based on the presentation. So thank you all so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Kerry. And I think hopefully others agree. And I apologize, I still unfortunately have to be on my phone. So when we do go to Q&A, Kerry, I'm going to have you manage that because I can't see everybody at once. But thank you so much. I hope others share my response, and having looked at this is and going like, yes, yes, yes. That in each of these buckets, I feel like our work at Towards Employment and our work across the community, that there's things happening in each of those 5 areas. And between information access and accuracy, the skills and credentials, social capital, the wraparound supports, but in acknowledging that the need for systemic changes. But to see it sort of packaged in this way, and hopefully this conversation can support our ongoing conversations about how we can connect and align to try to maximize the number of folks who have access to all of these supports to truly support wage and career progression. Because Kerry had some recommendations sort of by stakeholder, we've invited 3 stakeholders to maybe give some initial remarks about either reaction to this, to highlight some things that are going on, or to highlight things that they'd like to learn more about. So we have Kathy Belk. Hopefully she is still here, from the Deaconess Foundation, but also the Workforce Funders Group and a member of the Workforce Board. We have Michelle Rose, the Executive Director of our Public Workforce Board, now Greater Cleveland Works, and Heidi Garcia from Towards Employment, from a practitioner standpoint. So let me start with, if I could, with Kathy.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jill. I really appreciate this opportunity to learn about this today with all of you. And I'm really encouraged by what you said, Jill, which was like, yes, 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 we're doing lots of things in this area. That's sort of my general impression too, is while of course we can always do better and want to do better, I felt like I had in my head several examples of things I've heard about that are new in sort of each of these areas. So I'm really encouraged to hear you say that that's sort of, and I saw some heads nodding, that's the impression everybody has too. I'll just share, I guess, a couple of reactions, particularly in light of the role of like philanthropy more broadly. The first is that the one thing I'm really interested in, and I think all philanthropy in Greater Cleveland would be interested in, is understanding where you all see the gaps. And I think that was one of the questions. But given what I just said, oh, looks like we're doing really good work in some of these areas. Certainly we can do more work. Where is the most important work to be done? What is the biggest gap from your perspective that would have the greatest impact to the work you all do every day? That's not obvious to me. And that feels like something that would be really helpful for our system to understand. And when I mean that, I mean all of us, like all of us, to kind of say, hey, the biggest gaps we think exist in this 1 or 2 or 3 areas. From the perspective of the Workforce Funders Group, that group is sort of finalizing its strategies for the next several years. And I know it has a commitment to career pathway work, to data systems, to innovation. All of those things sort of align really nicely with some of the career coaching learnings that were expressed today. So both individual funders and that group would be really interested in understanding where the gap is, or the gaps, and how we might want to marshal and prioritize those in solution creation. So that's my primary takeaway. The second thing I wanted to mention was sort of a smaller point in the presentation, but something that I've been in maybe 5 webinars about in the last month, which is the use of AI in personal coaching. I just don't want us to be on our back foot in thinking about artificial intelligence tools, not how they're going to replace us. You all are not replaceable, but how they can make us smarter and better in the work that we do, and how they can take away the parts of the jobs that are not high value added and allow everybody on your teams and all of us really to do our better work, like our thinking, the parts of us that are uniquely human, how we can bring more of that to the work, because some of the other aspects of our jobs are done through the computer. So that to me felt really important. and is something that I'm going to continue to learn more about, because I do think we're at the beginning of a, like a transformation the size of the kind we went through in the 90s when we didn't have email and then all of a sudden we did, or we didn't have the internet and all of a sudden we did. I think this is that one now for that. So those were sort of my two general thoughts.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that reaction. And in thinking about, your question about the gaps, certainly AI would be one of my top ones in terms of better understanding, being prepared for it not being at your back foot, and how to use the technology actually to help drive more personalized, interaction. The other two things in terms of the three buckets of types of career navigation, I do think that the tools for adults, some of the career navigation, and we've got great representation here with GCC and others who are really YOU, who are focusing on helping younger people understand what options are available for them. But that middle group, those adults who are in low mobility jobs, I think we've had less attention on actual giving them the opportunity to explore and understand what their options might be, is one thing. And then we can't let that question pass without talking about, how to coaching more, training for more coaches, and better and more training for more coaches to do the kind of work that we're trying to describe here. So with that, let me pass to Michelle. Hopefully you are, I can't see everybody, but hopefully there you are. There you are. Thank you.
I know it's hard to be on your phone. Thank you so much for having me. This is a paper that I read last year when it came out, that I shared with my board and my staff, and that I find to be such a helpful roadmap for how we can think differently and act differently, especially at a one-stop or a American Job Center, as they're called, but at our Workforce Development Board, which oversees our one-stop. I agree with everything Kathy said. I think one of the big gaps on my mind is that wasn't mentioned as much is how we can kind of formalize and sustain the social capital growth. I know this is something that Jessica has raised many times and is a passion for her. To me, that is one of the things that I don't quite understand how we are doing as a community. But I feel like we're strong on a lot of the other things, as Kathy mentioned. So I just want to agree with the comments around this. One thing I was really struck by, Kerry, and that I haven't really thought a lot about, but is so true, is this idea of career exposure for adults, and how we kind of we treat adults differently in a way when it comes to this very personal conversation that coaches have with people, where we're constantly trying to balance someone's wants, needs, and interests and skills with what is in demand and what is a career pathway. And so that conversation and how that conversation plays out between job seekers and coaches is of huge interest to me. So it was great to have some data around it, and the idea that we can move towards best practices in our community. But that is really hard work to make consistent across every provider, that conversation. So I think that is the work ahead for us. I also just really love the guiding principles. I found myself wanting to just copy and paste them into our next job seeker services RFP. So maybe we'll do that. So thank you for presenting to us today. And I am excited to hear from the rest of the group, because we will do this work together.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And off to Heidi, wherever she is. There she is.
Here I am. Thanks. I think for me, one of the things that I think it's really important that we really focus on is the long-term coaching. It's been really successful. It's allowed us to help build confidence and relationship building, not only with the participants, but more importantly for each other. We see it all the time that they're cheering each other on during training. And we learn all the time that they're creating group chats. They're celebrating each other's wins, and definitely encouraging and supporting each other That's been really nice to be a part of and encourage, and making sure that we're then creating other opportunities for them to come in to meet the, the current cohorts that are going in training, so they can continue to add that like level of support for, those that are newly coming into training and you're really unsure, you know what I mean, if it's the place for them. So that's been really nice.
Great. So that contributes a bit to the social capital development, building your own
Absolutely.
newer networks. Yeah. Yeah.
Mhm.
Excellent. So we have a great array of expertise and perspectives as we think about those the five different stakeholders' recommendations. I want to open it up to questions, comments, and if you want to identify yourself as coming from one of those five stakeholder perspectives, please do. But introduce yourself and say where you're from for as you make your comment or question. And I'm going to hand off to Kerry to be able to acknowledge folks because I can't see everybody raising their hand.
Sounds great. Thanks, Jill. And thank you for those thoughtful reflections and reactions. I think, it's all, it's great to hear what's going on in Ohio. So I'm really excited for, your questions and your reflections. And I can add, I have about 7,000, but I narrowed down to 6 discussion questions as well that I would love to hear from all of you. And then I'm happy to talk about some of the ongoing research as well to answer some of these questions. But I'll first call on Eric from Tri-C, and I'm a big fan of the work that's happening at Tri-C and Dr. Baston. I was telling Jessica earlier, he has spoken at some of our convenings and it's great. But Eric.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Kerry. Thank you. So I am bringing my perspective of K-12 education and the increasing role and reliance on K-12 for the workforce, and my new experiences here at Tri-C. So 2 separate, but I think both important thoughts. One is that we have to work with policymakers to evolve K-12 so that work for the durable skills, we call them transferable skills, are prioritized, because right now we're still asking students to take tests on content that they can look up in Google. And that means that most systems are not spending their time on the readiness skills that we keep saying that we want. And that means K-12 has to start tapping into workforce training resources, because they're being asked to do this all on the same funding that they've been tasked to do other things. The larger picture, I do agree that Northeast Ohio is activating a lot of what Kerry just shared. But you have all heard me say for many years in this space that we're still doing it in too much of a transactional sort of way. And we know that almost none of us actually moved through a career pathway in the way we describe that people should move through. We also know, and Kerry mentioned it in the research, that a lot of how we got where we are is through our networking and relationships. And yet we don't have these aspiring young people, in my case, or early career people, welcomed into the networks until they've found their way into a role. And then we're surprised when they don't feel connected. And so, for example, we know the high number of students coming out of CMSD, Black and Hispanic and women, who are very interested in IT, and none of them are entering the IT sector. And that's a lot because they are not in the network. And so I say this to say the challenge for us is to think about how do we take all of these technical moves we're making, the right moves that we're doing well, and create the dynamic system that is where people actually will navigate. So thank you for letting me weigh in.
Eric, thank you so much. And I think a lot of folks are trying to think holistically about a social capital strategy and what does that look like. I mean, there are certainly some policies at the broader level around housing and some of those types of things. But I also think I would take a look at Climb Higher, which is a nonprofit that really embedded social capital into the structure. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about what we found because I think it might be interesting to this group. The first is that alumni can really be leveraged for social capital. So, bringing folks back in, encouraging them, just to encouraging someone to reach out and encouraging that person just to be there and come back and serve as a network is really a way to perpetuate it. I also think, in addition to the skills you talked about, there are social capital skills too. And knowing how to have the conversation, how to make quote unquote the ask, or really how to reach out, who to reach out to is also something that could be taken for granted from folks who just kind of learned it along the way. And so, beyond the connection itself, there's really also this kind of ability to leverage those connections. But thank you so much for your comments. And we didn't touch on K-12 in this report, but absolutely a crucial part of the picture, and certainly needs to be, thought about as well. Melissa.
Thanks. It's kind of hard to narrow down comments, but I've got three that I do want to just mention. I feel like, first of all, here in Cuyahoga County, we're pretty lucky that we have the partnerships that we do, and that workforce is working with philanthropy, working with employers, but I think it's still pretty fractured. And there's so many, kind of feel like there's so many tentacles to this that that it's really hard to put your attention fully to one. But I do think we're lucky to all be here and to have the people at the table I think that need to be. And I think the couple things, or the three things that stand out for me that I really think are important for success for the community and ourselves, is that employers, while we have some, employer investment is extremely important. And I think in general, employers feel like they are not a part of the solution for their employees. And I think that if we could really dig into that with more employers, I think we'd see great success, transportation, childcare, all of that stuff. The other thing is that I agree that working with more adults than the youth in the community, that there's not enough long-term funding to support us staying with somebody enough to get them from where they're at to where we want them to be. And there is an expectation of doing great things in short time with a little bit of money. And I feel like that's something that if we really could invest in people long-term, especially most of us took more than a year or 6 weeks, right, to get a job, to get where we are. And I echo Eric in that they need longer term investment, even if you're an adult and you're just trying to start your journey now. And then finally, I think that we also need to look within ourselves and the workforce development organizations themselves and our own employees, and thinking about how we can lift them as well, because they're there to lift other people, but sometimes they feel like they're not being lifted as well. And I feel like that's a space where, when we're talking about salaries and benefits and all of those things, that I feel like maybe sometimes we're lagging behind. And I just kind of want to highlight those three things. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Melissa. And I am so encouraged to see this group, and really want to applaud all of you for the amazing work you're doing, and for letting me join you and listen. And so thank you also for your questions and comments. I was going to respond to a point, but now I don't remember. I got too excited about this great group. So I will pass it, Ronnie.
Well, good morning, everyone. Again, Ronnie Cannon, Senior Manager of Community Engagement. First and foremost, I appreciate the comments that Eric and Melissa made. And it shows that there's a lot of synergy that's taking place in Cleveland, because I was kind of going along those same lines when it comes to like social capital and network building. But where I feel like, and even organizations like all of ours are somewhat guilty in our policies on how we hire individuals. Almost all of us, we do an internal hiring process first, right? Because that's just the way of the world. You got to offer it to the employers that's available. But then the next thing that happens, I think that where we kind of go wrong, we ask our employees, excuse me, we ask our employees to identify through a referral process, right? And oftentimes they're referring colleagues that they went to college with, friends and family, and it often ostracizes that person that, is just getting into the workforce, that they got their resume on Indeed. And then that's like that third pool of people that we try to tap into. So I think, we kind of like think through how that, how we all, enact our hiring practices across a wide, range of spectrums, including the employers that we, identify and that we work with, on how can we kind of like sort of change that, because you got this pool of people that didn't go to college, and outside of just those warm body jobs, it doesn't really allow for a leg up in, the hiring practice and everything. So yeah, just want to share that.
Thank you so much, Ronnie. And one thing I maybe didn't mention, and just thank you again for these comments, is the risk. I'm touching it a little bit, but this involves some of these things involve risk for employers that they're not willing to take. There's far less risk in hiring, a college grad that someone knows than someone who, might not have that degree and you might not know. And so I think we need to do more to de-risk that decision and track those and incentivize those practices as well.
Kerry, since we're talking about employers, I'm wondering if you have, I think we have some examples here, but, and I think to Melissa's point, do you have examples where you've seen employers do some of these things, these recommendations well, and where has the impetus for that come? We have, I think, Northeast Ohio, we've strong in sort of the idea of sector partnerships, and by bringing employers together to define some common needs, and it's also then an opportunity to better connect them to community resources and community-based pipelines, and create I think provide some supports that do de-risk bringing maybe non-traditional talent in or untapped talent pools. So where in your much broader purview, where have you seen that working? And again, what has been the impetus for employers to sort of take these steps? Is there philanthropy involved? Is it, programming? Is it connecting with the public workforce? Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. And I'd love to hear as well from all of you the examples that you have. As far as what we've seen bring employers to the table, it's really a tight labor market. A lot of employers we're seeing, they just don't have the workforce that they need. And so they're coming, to the table and saying, all right, we need to start looking at the folks that we haven't before. I think the labor market is softening a bit, but moving forward with our aging population, I do think we can expect a tight labor market, and that this will certainly encourage employers. I think we've seen that employers who kind of take the leap maybe in kind of one small space, they may have an internship program with Year Up, for example. Capital One is an example. Then that gives them the confidence to kind of spread it more broadly. I think some of the employer collectives too are helpful. So in Massachusetts, we have a new skills coalition that's bringing together employees through the business roundtable, as well as folks from the state. And so learning together and hearing best practices and kind of doing it with other employers has helped. There are some good examples of upskilling. BMW is kind of working on a massive upskilling of their employees into kind of the clean energy or electric vehicle space. I think some of the folks I would say wouldn't surprise you a ton. IBM has a pretty good history of this. We've seen, some good examples at the local level in Fidelity. Market Basket, actually, in Massachusetts, has done a lot with sort of employee autonomy and ownership, and the way that is encouraging folks to kind of move up and build pathways. And then, I think the last thing I'll say is, many of you know this, but you may take a look at the American Opportunity Index, which is an effort that has come from Schultz and Harvard and Burning Glass, which has kind of rated employees or employers on the way that they're advancing equitable talent practices. So you can find some examples there as well. Grads of Life also has some great case studies on their website. But those are a few of the trends we're seeing. I hope that's helpful, but we're really excited to hear what's happening. And I think that in Ohio, what's one of the wonderful things is really the community college partnerships with employers. And, that's something that we've seen to be really effective as well. In certain cases, Nova and AWS have a great partnership. And I know Intel is coming here, and there's a lot of opportunity, or is here already, and there's a lot of opportunity to build those partnerships. So I think it really requires cross-sector collaboration. But the tight labor market seems to be the real driver.
I just a follow up on that. The American Opportunity Index. I'm just curious, is it self-reported data, or is it?
It is not. So it's Burning Glass uses data from, they scrape data. So I can show you, I can put the link in the chat actually.
Thank you.
Kyle.
Good morning, all, and thank you, Kerry, for your comments. I've been a big fan of this work for a while, so it's been great to see you in person, or virtually, I should say. My question for you is, I'm a researcher by trade, so I'm kind of going to go down that road, and I'm pleased to see that you recommended more research, as a great researcher always does. But I'm curious, what do you think is kind of the air? Which of the drivers do you think deserves more attention?
You're setting me up so well, Kyle, because I'm going to talk now about our next research project, which actually started by focusing on this information driver that I mentioned, and because it touches so many pieces. But I think that's a key piece. And so right now, the survey is in the field of low-wage employees and community college students. And specifically, we're going to be learning how folks are accessing career information, how they are navigating their own values and skills and interacting with the labor market, whether they see themselves on career pathways. Are they getting information from family, friends, online? Like this, I think these things are really important to know so that we can reach people where they are. We're going to get a lot of insights, which I'm really excited about. We're going to have a paper in the spring, but something else, I didn't quite refer to the internal versus external information, career information, but there is this piece of understanding yourself and understanding your own skills. And so we are going to be asking folks whether they do feel they could articulate the skills they have. I think in terms of the skills-based talent ecosystem, a lot of the focus right now is on employers, which makes a lot of sense, but we need to also make sure that individuals can say or understand or can articulate what skills they have. So I would certainly say, the information piece, I think we need a lot more research into what works. I think all of these different tools, these different kind of supports out there, there's so little that we know, and we need to understand what works. I think we know coaching works, but we're not entirely sure what about coaching works. So I think, we don't know who makes a great coach, or what is the training that works for a great coach. And so I think, clearly that's something we need to invest in, but we should also research more to make sure that what we're investing in works. But I'm curious to hear from you, Kyle, like what you're interested in researching, and everyone else on this call too.
Just a quick follow-up and shameless plug for myself. I think we're playing off each other this morning, Kerry, because I would have said the information gap as well. And we just released at the Cleveland Fed, along with the Philadelphia Fed, we just released a new update to our Occupational Mobility Explorer. And I think that goes in the direction of providing information to folks. And I just had a fellow researcher comment to me the other day. He said, you should really try and do some randomized control trials to do that. And I think that just, it's while as a researcher, I understand going down that route of trying to be scientific about it. But, I think there's some trouble. There's the inner social worker in me has trouble withholding certain resources from folks and others. And I was wondering if you could have any comments about that too, and I'll throw something in the chat for folks.
Oh, that's a tough one. I think the ethical question is tough. I think, there could be some A/B testing potentially that could be done that might be, less scientific, but still allow you to, which we're thinking about too, in terms of the apps, like what works better, or if we were to present it in this way, is it more, compelling than this way? Or, if you're to advertise in this, kind of medium versus the other, what's more effective? That to me feels like a bit of a middle ground, but I'm on the same page for sure.
Having participated in a randomized control trial evaluation, I would certainly share Kyle's concerns, but also partly because you're testing a model, and so you can't change it, even though you're learning throughout the period. It's built in that you don't change it, and then it takes a long time to get the results. So by the time you then have the results, it's like, yeah, I already knew that in a sense, right? I mean, to some extent. And so I think it is, I think also one of the challenges is this idea of the fluidity, like the right services at the right time, depending on where you are in your career path, and you may advance, and nobody, I think Eric mentioned, nobody follows the career path the way it's laid out here. It's never linear. You may have setbacks, you may have, so it's also how to be nimble, or that the support system is nimble enough to be able to respond to where someone's at, because what's the right support, given, and it's never, no three people necessarily are going to need exactly the same thing. And so that always takes me back to the role of coaching, who can then assemble the right support. If you've got a great trained coach who has a relationship that's built on trust, then they can help navigate again and assemble sort of what the right supports are, at that time. And then it gets us back to what does good look like, and what is the training that gets us there around that coaching. So yeah, I'm kind of a one-note pony on that, but
Thank you so much. No, thank you all. This is so helpful, enlightening for me, and hopefully a great discussion for all of you too. Jill, one thing I heard recently was someone said we need we need navigators for career navigators, because there's so much information, so many resources, so many strategies out there. We also need to make sure we're supporting those coaches, not just like the mental health and kind of trauma informed, which is absolutely crucial, but also with how to provide those services. And so that's a place that could certainly use investment, to some of your earlier points, Kathy. Lori.
Good morning. It's a really great conversation, and I am a huge fan of talking about social capital and how its worth for individuals that are trying to strengthen their careers and go along a career pathway. One of the things that I'm interested in, Kerry, is I believe, and I've seen research that believes, and I work at the Literacy Cooperative, so I'm an intermediary, but we oversee Two-Gen Collaborative, which is whole family strategies towards employment, has been a great partner with that, and many on this as well. The social capital element, to me, which is a real big, strong component of Two-Gen as well, is great for families and for the job seeker. However, I think that we do not do enough among our colleagues to increase social capital, because they're coming to us to get the network, right? They're coming to us many times and saying, who do you know? How do I do this? We just mentioned that you're not going to be along a straight career pathway, most likely. So, where do I go from here? I have this, and what do I do with it? So I really think that we need to look at ways that we can build the social capital of our direct service staff, as well as our administrators, just to make sure that we are aware of all of the opportunities that are available, and that we are able to strategize with participants as they come in and they're asking for guidance. And, we don't keep on, well, here's the career pathway for it, but here's some other angles. And, oh, you're struggling with something totally unrelated to looking for a career. Let's get you the help you need on there. So I'm just wondering, Kerry, if that fits in with what you're seeing as well.
Well, certainly. And, I think the family strategy makes sense. I think some of the early results we're seeing is, folks are making decisions based on their families, in a lot of ways, families and friends. And so that's where they're getting information. That's where they're, getting advice. That's what they see as most helpful. And so I think including the full family is absolutely crucial. And yeah, we each certainly have a role to play in the social capital conversation. Thank you so much for those thoughts, Lori. Marissa.
Thank you for this great conversation. I wondered if you could speak to, so a lot of what you present is related, at least from my understanding, related to like workforce money that's specifically earmarked for workforce development. And I was wondering if you had any best practices to share about kind of different people getting different streams of funding. And the reason I ask this is I literally came from a digital equity meeting yesterday, and the same conversations related to digital navigators and all of the same conversations about career coaching and how to train the trainers is also happening in different parallel work streams that are funded by different federal grants. And so, and I know we all experience this, but I didn't know if you had any kind of things that you gleaned from your research that could be helpful for understanding kind of how to work across these different things.
That's a great question. Where I've seen the most braiding of funding, we've actually done some research at the, this doesn't quite answer your question, but at the state level. So we're currently interviewing governors and their workforce advisors to understand how they're leveraging authority over their workforce systems and how they're aligning. I think this comes at the system level, aligning education, economic development, workforce development, all of these different funding goals. I think having a unified state plan is really helpful there. At the organizational level, I mean, I think that's certainly a great point. I think these convenings with different actors certainly help, but would love to hear more from you about kind of what works. And I think that's like a really great question. We've heard, I would say, more of like braiding, like starting with philanthropy and then using that to, kind of collect more funding from the government, but I think it's a tough challenge. Yeah. Sorry, I don't have a great answer for that one.
I'm now looking forward to the research when you interview state governors. So I'm going to look for that one for sure.
That will be coming out in March.
Excellent. Thank you.
Bill, I don't see anyone else with their hand up.
Harry,
I don't know
I have
if
a question.
Oh, yes.
Hi, sorry.
No.
Thanks for sorry for not raising my hand here. Nice to see everyone. Phil Walls, work with College Now, Greater Cleveland. I have a question about a lot of the conversation has been framed with social capital as though there's a great level of control over social capital. I think the research sort of shows that there may not be a whole lot of control over the amount of social capital one may have. But you did mention a couple really interesting things that I was curious if you could expound upon a little more in terms of strategies to increase social capital that kind of overcome some of the structural barriers. Could you shine a little more light briefly on what some of those strategies may be that we could implement, whether it be in our coaching conversations or at a macro level, as kind of a coalition here? What are some of the strategies that we can implement to overcome some of the things that we can't control with an individual social capital?
That is a great question, Phil. And oftentimes the social capital problem feels a bit intractable. I think, Raj Chetty's research has found that, and I mentioned this a little bit, but areas with strong cross-connectedness, so strong networks or strong institutions that bring together folks from across income levels can be really effective, or lead to more social mobility. So an example that he gives is actually in Utah, the Mormon church has been a big player in terms of building social capital across networks. So I think to the extent there, and I'm not saying, religion is the answer, but to the extent that there are institutions that can bring people together, or organizations that can bring people together across income levels, that certainly seems to work. As I mentioned, there have been some kind of social capital strategies around bringing back alumni who've gone through a program and now, are in kind of a better job or have more connections, and making sure that is kind of like a perpetual cycle. And then at the systems level, really looking at just housing and, ensuring we have low income housing in different, in high income areas, and really bridging those gaps. But I think there's a lot of work to be done in this space, and we've seen, some things done at a really micro level. And so I'd be really interested to see what works at a more macro level. I think that's a tough problem. And if you all are working on it, would love to hear from you as well.
Thanks, appreciate that.
Eric.
Thank you again. And again, my colleagues here in Northeast Ohio have heard me say this too many times, but I just can't not remind us that we have to be exceedingly careful as we continue to try to create access for those who have been marginalized, not to be good deeders that simply trap people under a paper ceiling, because we tell them that they don't need the same credentials that allows all of us to be sitting here today. And again, Kerry's research early, Kerry, you mentioned about how many people have been invited into what are called opportunity jobs, but they never manifest into actual growth. So I just want to remind us that we keep getting narratives and messages, particularly in these days in policymakers and many other places, that not everybody needs a degree. And there's practical truth to that, but there's also a reality that marginalized people are the ones that are being told that, and that there is a paper ceiling when we use that as our only strategy. So I just want to keep the equity question in front of us so that we continue to wrestle with the complexities of that as we do this important work.
Thank you so much, Eric, for raising that, and came up at a conversation yesterday as well, which again, another plug for sort of the longer term coaching and also the role of employers, because I think the sort of skills-based hiring approach and figuring out how to get a practical credential to start a job doesn't preclude the idea of ongoing continuing education and continuing to work to create opportunities to be able to then continue your education, maybe now paid for by your employer, right? And so keeping those dual strategies in mind, that one doesn't preclude the other. And again, how do we, that same theme, why does the opportunity job not manifest itself? Because this idea of lifelong learning, the idea of how to continue to support someone to grow and eventually gain those credentials, but maybe not have to do it in a way that creates a lot of debt, et cetera, et cetera. So like, again, that idea of multiple pathways and one not precluding the other, but this ongoing support, whether through social capital or through a career coach type relationship. So I think it's a really important point to continue to discuss.
And I think we definitely need more research on, I say again, but on the skills-based talent practices. I'm really glad you bring that up, Eric. I think it shows promise, but, I'll say, just like add my little 2 cents fear is I fear a little bit creating two pathways, like a skills-based track and like a degree track. And then we're kind of, segregating folks into different opportunities. We'll say there's some research on what employers can do to kind of encourage folks to take up upskilling opportunities. And one of those is just making clear the outcome and the incentive to do it. So folks might have upskilling programs at their place of work or organization, but they don't know why or what it leads to or what. So kind of clarifying, if you do this program, it will lead to this higher wage in this position is like a kind of promising practice that folks at the business school, Rafaela Sadoun in particular, has done research on this. But thank you so much. Kyle also has his hand raised. Jill, I know we have 10 minutes, so I didn't know if we should continue this discussion or what you wanted to do to with this time.
That's fine. Maybe this is the time for conversation. So Kyle, please go ahead.
Thank you again, Kerry, for your comments. One thing that I kind of realized that just hasn't come up in this conversation, I'm kind of surprised it hasn't, the topic of job quality and employers on that side of things. Have you seen any, in your work, have you seen any evidence of progress on that front? Do you feel like job quality is an issue that is going to leave us and come back again? I feel like it's like a lot of workforce issues. There's a reoccurring cycle. So I guess, for lack of no longer rambling, but I'm just curious to your perspective on the job quality issue.
Yes, that certainly is part of the conversation. I think when we say job quality, folks are talking about different things. And I think another spoiler of upcoming research, and I swear I haven't just, come onto this to like get you to go on our website. But we do have upcoming research. Joe Fuller has been surveying employers and employees to understand what they think a good job is. I think a lot of the job quality frameworks have been developed by folks in our fields. And so it's important to think of what people actually think of as a good job, like what actually, and we're going to be asking some of these questions too. Absolutely, job quality is a crucial piece of the puzzle. And I think, there's some, from the policy side, thinking about advancement and paths to advancement as a component of job quality is certainly something we've thought of. And within kind of the WIOA high demand occupation list, there are some things state policymakers can do. For example, I come back to Virginia, but they've included as one of the components of the job quality list, advancement, opportunities for advancement, to add another kind of component or another dimension to which jobs qualify. And so I think there are certainly things we can do to direct money towards good jobs. We can set, key industries that, lead to good jobs and lead to advancement. But that's certainly part of the conversation. And it's sort of a dual conversation too of, right, like lifting the floor, making all jobs good jobs, but also making sure we're not funneling, too many Black women into direct care jobs, for example. And I think, there's a lot of evidence that that's happening.
And I saw a lot of overlap. The recommendations for employers that you lift up are part of the job quality conversation, right? When we think about what makes for a quality job. Yeah. Well, I think I can't, if there are no more hands up.
No more hands up.
Okay. All right. Well, I really want to thank Kerry for coming and sharing this work with us and leaving us with a lot to think about, examples to further explore. And I love your chart with specific tools that that you've recommended, and I think would love to dig deeper into that. Thank you everyone on the call for joining us, for listening, for sharing your thoughts. We really appreciate your participation and in thinking through these really important topics with us. So with that, I think
thank you so much, Jill, I just want to know, I put my email in the chat. So feel free to reach out. Happy to continue the conversation with anyone, but thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful day. And if I don't see you guys in the next few days, have a wonderful Thanksgiving.